All right, we want to go ahead and talk just a little bit about our Constitution, the United States Constitution. And we're going to go ahead and break that down into just different sections. The Constitution itself is broken into 7 different sections, along with a section for amendments. And today we're only going to really talk about Article 1 and some of the general principles that have to do with our Constitution, some of the general background information that you're going to need to know. A little bit of background about the American Constitution, the United States Constitution. It was written in 1787 and approved in 1788. And the primary guy who was the driver behind it, who really authored a lot of at least the original language that was sometimes amended in different ways by the Congress, was a guy by the name of James Madison, or at least the Constitutional Convention, excuse me, was James Madison. He's oftentimes called the father of the U.S. Constitution. He was really the brains behind a lot of what was written down. And some of the important principles that he enshrined in the United States Constitution had to do with ideas such as federalism. The idea that really sovereignty, the powers of our government, were divided between the state and national governments. And there's basically 4 different types of powers talked about in the Constitution. The first are denied powers, powers which are denied to government, like the power to grant nobility. Our government doesn't have the power to do that, and it's denied to both the states and the federal government. Others are concurrent powers, and as the name would suggest, these are powers that they both have. For instance, probably the most prominent is levying taxes. Both states and the federal government can levy taxes. Delegated powers are those that are specifically given to the federal government, and then reserved powers are those powers which are reserved to the states. And so 4 different types of powers that are discussed within our Constitution. Another one of the important principles enshrined in the document is the separation of powers. It divides power between the national government and the states, but also amongst the national government itself into the 3 equal branches. On the one hand, you have the Congress, which has certain powers and jobs that it's supposed to do, primarily to legislate, to pass laws and approve laws. The president, who is the commander-in-chief of the military, and whose job it is really to execute the laws. So if Congress passes a law, it's the president's job to implement it, to put it into effect, and to uphold it. And then the Supreme Court, whose job it is to interpret the laws that are passed by the Congress and enforced by the president. Each branch has certain powers that check the others, a system of checks and balances, if you will, so that not one branch becomes too powerful. They were meant to, by design, to fight with one another for power, to check the power of the other. And so when you see our branches of government fighting with one another, that's by design. That's what it was intended to do. Another principle that's enshrined in the U.S. Constitution is the supremacy of national law. The national law, that is the supreme law of the land, is comprised of 3 different and distinct things. The United States Constitution makes up part of the supreme law of the land. U.S. laws also, and then U.S. treaties are also binding on all the states. So the supreme law of the land is really 3 things: the Constitution, the laws of the U.S., and the treaties that we sign. Also, Madison wanted our Constitution to be flexible, to be able to adapt over time. And one thing you'll hear talked about a lot is what's called the elastic clause, that our government was allowed to do what's necessary and proper, pass laws that are necessary and proper to carry out the powers given to them in the Constitution. So a lot of times this is quoted as providing some flexibility in what the government's allowed to do. But more than that even, what provides the flexibility of our Constitution is the amendment process. We were allowed to change our Constitution. The first step in the amendment process is the proposal of an amendment, and this can be done in one of 2 ways. Amendment might be proposed by a 2/3 majority of each house, so both the House of Representatives and the Senate, or a 2/3 of all the state legislatures. If they vote to pass an amendment, that will be, again, go up for ratification. The more common way is the first way. The 2/3 of each house of the federal government, the House and the Senate, go ahead and propose. To ratify, then, you need 3/4 of the state legislatures to approve it. And so the federal government really has no role in ratification. The states have to ratify changes to the U.S. Constitution, and it's got to be 3/4 of them. Or the states could choose to ratify it rather than in their legislatures. They could call a special convention just for the purpose of ratifying the constitutional amendments, or for amending the Constitution. So they could go ahead and call special conventions, constitutional conventions, just for that purpose. Also, then, there's certain things that have kind of creeped in that maybe Madison didn't necessarily intend, but they become part of what's called the Unwritten Constitution, ways in which our government functions that weren't necessarily directly outlined. They're governed by things like customs and traditions. Um, Maybe court decisions influence that. Political parties certainly are a great example of this. In their constitution, there's no examples of political parties. This is something that has just developed organically and naturally around um, some of the more dominant figures in our political system. Today we have two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. And this is really nothing more than a custom or tradition. Another great example of that would be the president's cabinet, where the president meets with all of his advisors, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense. There's no provision for a cabinet in the United States Constitution. It just simply has developed over time through legislation and is really just a custom. The legislature then is really what's in Article 1. So let's talk a little bit about the legislature. The legislature is made up of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We're going to talk about the House first. In order to be a member of the House, you have to be at least 25 years old, and you have to have been a citizen in the United States for 7 years. Further, you have to be a resident of the state from which you are elected. So if you're a representative from Illinois, you have to live in Illinois. Members of the House are only elected to 2-year terms, so every 2 years, the entire House, all 435 members, are turned over, are up for re-election. And so this is certainly the most responsive House to the will of the American people, because it's every 2 years they're up for re-election. Our representative here from Crystal Lake is a guy by the name of Adam Kinzinger. We are part of the 16th Congressional District. Adam Kinzinger is new. He was just defeated our incumbent, the guy who had been there before, Don Manzullo, in the last election cycle. The upper chamber, then, of our legislature, again, the two houses, we have the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, the upper house, which is the Senate. To be a member of the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old, and you have to have been a citizen for 9 years and a resident of the state from which you're representing. Senators are elected for 6-year terms, and each state gets only 2. So there's a total of 100 members in the Senate. Our senators are Dick Durbin and Mark Kirk. Senators were originally meant to represent the states. They were not elected by the people. They were elected by the state legislatures originally. That was changed back in the early 1900s, and now our senators are elected directly by the people of each state. But really the upper chamber, the Senate, is really more about representing the needs of the states, whereas the House of Representatives is more about representing the needs of the individuals and the people of the state. Some of the powers that are given to Congress, they have the power to tax. It is Congress that has the power to borrow money and to also spend money. That's what's going on right now in Washington. They have the power to provide for defense, the power to provide for the general welfare. There are certain powers that are also forbidden Congress, again, denied to them. They cannot pass an ex post facto law, which is a law that says, hey, if you commit a certain crime, this is the penalty, and it's retroactive. So in other words, if you committed the crime before the law was passed, well, then it wasn't a crime. So you can't be punished for it. So that's an ex post facto law. Say, hey, it's illegal to eat apples. You ate an apple yesterday, so now you're going to jail for that. Well, it wasn't illegal when you did it. So Congress can't punish you for something that was legal at the time when you did it. They're not allowed to place duties on exports, so they're not allowed to tax things we're sending overseas, and they are not allowed to grant titles of nobility. So those are powers that are forbidden. The lawmaking process itself, so the Congress, the Senate and the House are our legislative body. And how do they make laws? Well, a bill can be proposed in either house. A bill can start in the Senate or it can start in the House of Representatives, with the one notable exception. Revenue bills having to do with the money, spending money, taxing, things like that, they have to start in the House of Representatives. They cannot start in the Senate. A bill, for a bill to become a law, it has to be passed by a majority of both houses, and it has to be signed by the president. However, if the president decides to veto a law, in other words, not to approve it, not to sign it, if he vetoes it and disapproves of it, it can still be passed over his veto with a 2/3 majority of each house agreeing that it should be law, and then in which case the presidential veto is overridden. The only type of veto that cannot be overridden is something called a pocket veto. It's a little quirk in the process. According to the Constitution, the president has 10 days to sign a law. If he doesn't sign it after 10 days, it becomes a law. Or he could choose to send it back to the Congress for them to go ahead and debate different objections the president might have. However, if Congress passes a law, let's say with 8 days left, well, the president doesn't have his 10 days. And if that's the case, if the president doesn't sign it into law before the session of Congress adjourns, that's called a pocket veto. The bill is killed, and Congress will have to take it up again and pass it again in the next session. So there's no chance to override a pocket veto. The president just simply leaves it on his desk and doesn't sign it.